Have you ever noticed the foul, almost rancid odor of money? Not so much fresh from the mint, but once it's been in circulation through all those hands.
"Shut up and open the damned safe,"
the voice behind him growled, pressing the barrel of the gun against the back of his head.
"Or the next thing you smell will be your fucking brains on their way out."
Edward sighed and resumed dialing the combination to open the safe. The voice behind him sounded mildly desperate, but coherent. It wasn't a drug-fueled panic, so he estimated his odds on not being shot were even, at least. The more professional the thief, the less they'd be inclined to kill their victim. The tumblers clicked in place as he dialed in the final number, and he dropped the metal handle down, swinging the heavy door open. "Now what?" he asked, remembering something he'd once read about a small-caliber revolver being the hitman's weapon of choice, because a shot behind the ear would ricochet around inside the skull, doing extreme damage.
"Now this,"
the voice growled again. And then something that felt like a truck slammed the back of his head, and his world turned dark and quiet. It was the incessant throbbing that roused him sometime later, reaching back and gingerly touching the large lump with dried blood crusting the edge. Better that than the hole I wondered about, he thought. He opened his eyes slowly, the dim room light enough to send new slivers of pain arching through his head. "Slow and steady wins the race," he muttered as he eased himself up enough to check his surroundings. Office floor, safe open in front of him, cash missing, papers rifled, tossed about as expected. He sat perfectly still for a few moments, waiting to regain his equilibrium, then kneeled in front of the safe. Edward pressed the side of what appeared to be a shelf support, and the bottom of the safe popped up in front, revealing a compartment in the false bottom. He lifted it up and sighed deeply as he saw the manuscript safely in place. He ran his fingers lightly, almost reverently, across the obscene cover, purported to be human flesh. The money can be replaced, but this... He'd spent more than half a lifetime seeking the actual print, and had this safe made specifically to protect it. He pressed the bottom back down, the reassuring clicks confirming the cover had locked back in place. Unlike Lovecraft's fictional Necronomicon, this tome had no title, and the few in the world that knew of its existence referred to it as Divinitatum Tenebris, Latin for dark divinity. As far as he'd been able to learn, this manuscript was the only one ever produced, handwritten in blood, bound in flesh, and older than man. When it came into his possession, it came with a stern warning to never, under any circumstances, read anything aloud from it. The hellish horrors he might unwittingly unleash would be far worse than anything human imagination could possibly comprehend. He'd not only heeded that advice, but had added a codicil to his will to ensure the safe was to be comprehensively destroyed upon his passing, never opened again for any reason. He wasn't sure the manuscript could be destroyed, but he'd at least try to imprison it in molten steel for all time. He'd never been able to validate the rumors surrounding this manuscript, but intended to be a responsible custodian nonetheless. Edward left everything else as it was, to let the police examine and look for evidence when they arrived. Speaking of which, he slowly stood, still dizzy, and made his way carefully to the desk and picked up the phone. No dial tone, dead silent. He chuckled ruefully, realizing a pro would have cut the lines before breaking in. Very well, he'd need to go to his briefcase in the front hall and get the cell phone he kept there. 4 hours later, the sun was rising, casting long shadows over the line of vehicles finally leaving, their work done. He'd given them free rein of his home. They'd found where the burglar had entered and compromised his alarm system. He'd been interviewed by at least 3 detectives, inventoried the contents of the safe after they checked for evidence, and verified the only thing missing was the emergency cash he kept on hand. He'd let the EMTs check him over and decline their suggestion to take him in for examination. He had a hell of an egg, but didn't feel any of the signs associated with concussion, and frankly had too much to do to endure a prolonged hospital visit. He reviewed the list he'd made: telephone company to repair the line, a glazier to repair the window, the alarm company to repair the alarm wires, the insurance company to report the theft. The list went on and on, he thought. "Oh, yes, and you too," he murmured as he jotted his physician's name on the list. Edward Wharton was many things, but a fool was not one of them. He declined the hospital visit, but thought it wise to have his doctor look him over. A bookseller by trade, he specialized in rare books, the first editions long out of print, editions believed to be lost, and, in the instance of the one hidden in his safe, books thought not to exist outside of fiction. He'd cultivated his sources carefully over the years, and his clients equally so. His reputation for finding the impossible was well-deserved among them all. It was that well-honed negotiating skill that enabled him to remain calm in the presence of the thief. Unsure if cash was the target, but not willing to reveal the possibility that there was something else, something of far greater value within that safe. His musing was interrupted by the doorbell. It was time for the repairs and restoration to begin. Many hours later, the workmen all gone and finished, Edward poured bourbon over ice in a tumbler and stood at the window with a western view. He looked forward to the peace he always found watching the sunset, the darkening sky ablaze with rich color. Something was nagging at him, something he couldn't quite place. He knew he'd verified the book was in its place, had even reached out and touched the cover to reassure himself that his treasure was safe. Still, he shook his head, determined to push aside and enjoy the vista his window offered. Whatever was nagging him could wait a while, especially after the day he'd had. He took a deep sip and his head tilted to the side. It wasn't time for sunset, yet the sky was darkening early. As he watched, he realized the darkness was due to an enormous cloud that was moving faster than any cloud he'd ever seen before. He set the tumbler on the desk and leaned into the window, squinting to see better. The cloud had an extraordinary shape, an immense spiral with tentacle-shaped tendrils coming out from the bottom. As the cloud got closer, he recoiled away from the window, gasping. The cloud was a maelstrom of flying creatures, having thick, leathery flaps beneath their arms and forelegs. Some sort of muscular appendage that ended in thick hands or paws with sharp claws on them. Black or dark gray, covered completely with fur. Something like a bat, but the size of a man, a very large man at that. Their heads were hideous, a large misshapen mass seeming to have a row of eyes above a gaping maw filled with sharp-looking teeth, and a second mouth above its eyes, also filled with ferocious-looking teeth. No snout, no ears, just eyes and those horrific mouths. Their legs were thickly muscled, the rear paws also bearing long talons. These things were airborne predators, unlike anything he'd ever seen. Their very existence railed against Edward's neat, orderly way of life, his beliefs and his experiences. But there they were. Worse yet, there had to be thousands, hundreds of thousands of these things. His eyes widened as it finally occurred to him. Beyond comprehension. The book had been face down in its compartment. He always stored it face up, the intricate carvings visible as soon as he popped the compartment open. He hadn't felt anything but the coarse texture of the cover, the rear cover, when he reassured himself that it was there earlier. The thief must have found it, removed it, and then carelessly returned it. That was the only answer. But what else had he done? Had he read anything aloud? He turned away from the window, running toward his safe when the windows all imploded. A few of those things flying in, screeching, reaching for him. God help us all, he thought as the talons tore into his shoulders, pulling his head back toward the salivating mouths of the thing. And then He thought no more.